So, here we are. You're lying down, or pretending to. Maybe your feet are warm, and your air smells like detergent and power outlets. You might be checking your phone one last time, just to see what the world is doing before you give up on it for the evening. But the Qing Dynasty didn't have phones, or clean socks, or electricity, or exit plans. The final embroidered sigh of 2,000 years of emperors, bureaucracy, and people being told what to do by someone in silk with terrible breath. And that's where we're going. They conquered the Ming, and so they settled in for a few centuries of slow collapse. China, sometime between 1644 and 1912, though time was more of a gentle suggestion back then, especially if you were a farmer named Sao with 7 teeth and 1 goat, peasants who didn't have fingernails at all, eunuchs with secrets, rebels with dreams, foot binding. This is the Qing, the last imperial dynasty. The Manchus had ridden in from the north, big hats, fields of millet, long fingernails. That meant, I don't work. And rules, so many rules. Don't look at the emperor. Don't wear bright yellow unless you'd like to disappear. And emperors who haven't seen their own shoes in years, under banners written in scripts. Don't laugh during court ceremonies unless you're very sure everyone else is laughing too. And for most people, life was hard, not tragic. And so we'll wander now, slowly, past temples. We'll meet villagers, bandits, doctors who swear duck bile cures everything, scholars who cry about metaphors. You don't need to know anything. We'll do the remembering for you. Because this is not a documentary, it's a quiet descent into the strangeness of survival in a world of incense, wooden pillows. Let's begin, as all proper stories do, with a dirt road. It is long. It curves past rice paddies that haven't seen proper rain in a season or two. It smells faintly of sweat, and the particular melancholy that only clings to places where no one has ever worn comfortable shoes. A rooster crowed, not because it wants to just. This is a small rural town, somewhere in northern Qing China, the kind of place where the word modernity has san ti, which is a lovely word historians use to mean you were born poor, you will die poor, and in between you'll spend a great deal of time very close to mud. His wife will call her Madam Wong, hunched in the shade of a thatched roof, spinning threads so fine it could pass for a spider's bad idea. The people here, mostly peasant. He's 47 but looks 80. He's been bent slightly leftward. Often it's millet boiled into a sad, grey gruel flavoured with yesterday's salt. Hoeing, planting, harvesting, depending on the season and how generous heaven is feeling this year. There are no holidays. Weddings are rare. Funerals are common. Births are expected. Deaths are predictable. Maybe younger, if your parents are worried about the tax grain. If they are, walking is a kind of slow, daily agony. If they're not, you're probably working harder than anyone else in the household, and still not allowed to sit down during meals, or she won't marry at all. And the neighbors will whisper about curses and ghosts. You chew slowly, not out of enjoyment, but to convince yourself you're fuller than you are. A slow, dependable tedium. Nor you. His hands are thick with calluses. His feet are bare. His breath smells like pickled radish and unspoken regret. You stay quiet when your mother-in-law scolds you, which she does often and with impressive creativity. There's a schoolroom. If the village is lucky, the classic texts are copied with aching hands. The analects, the book of songs, hoping one day their brushstrokes might look confident enough to impress someone with a mustache and a stamp. Let's take a closer look. That man over there, the one hauling water from the well with a bamboo yoke across his shoulders, that's old Lee. Girls aren't taught much beyond needlework and the fine art of politely vanishing, and he is on the whole considered lucky. Old Lee owns land, just enough for millet. You eat steamed greens, or a bit of tofu if you've been especially lucky. Meat is rare. It appears for festivals, for funerals, for bribes. Occasionally a traveling herbalist wanders through, offering deer antler powder to cure infertility and fainting spells. He's not very good. You just bow. Not because you're devout. His edicts are posted on walls. In winter, the wind slips through the gaps with a kind of whispered cruelty. Taxes are collected here. Disputes are settled. Punishments are handed out in the form of bamboo beatings, which are as enjoyable as they sound. It's best not to be noticed by the Yarman short rains. Bitter tea. A neighbor who won't stop borrowing your broom. A mother-in-law. If your name comes up, it usually means something has gone spectacularly wrong. In summer, another for the earth god. Offerings are made in scents. Bowls of rice, oranges, paper money, burned in delicate spirals of smoke. Their house, mud, walls, thatch, roof, a sleeping platform made of bamboo, and the prayers of 1,000 aching joints. And yet, there is a rhythm to life here. You wake up when the rooster screams. You eat, congeef. Then it's off to the fields. You're married off at 13. You cook if there's food to cook. And if you have a daughter, you sigh, because now you'll need to save up for her dowry, or you won't, and she marry poorly. The village itself is not big. A shrine at the entrance. Red characters painted on the doorways. There's also the local Yamenda administrative office, run by a man with a thin mustache and absolutely no sense of humor. Religious life, constant but not loud. There are temples. You don't pray loudly. Education, rare, but that's for boys. At night, you sit under a flickering oil lamp. The insects buzz. The pigs snort in their penwitch. What is there to say? And the day after that, the emperor is far away, but still you bow toward the capital on New Year's Day. Because, what if? Because this is your life. Dry soil. And somehow, it all continues. Not happily, not miserably, just endlessly. So, you've woken up. The rooster's scream is still echoing in your left ear. There's something crawling near your foot. You sit up on the bamboo platform you call a bed, knees crackling like kindling. Your back is already aching, not from the day's work ahead, but from the 20 years behind it. Your pillow was carved from wood intended to straighten your neck and remind you that comfort is for spirits, not peasants. The first thing you notice, as always, is the smoke. The smell of cooking oil and damp straw blends into that strange sleepy perfume of the rural Qing morning. It's not pleasant, but it is expected. From the fire pit, from the neighbors' chimneys, from the blackened walls that seem to exhale it every time someone breathes too loudly. It clings to your hair. It's everywhere. The air inside your home is thick with it. Outside, the wind is rising. Breakfast is simple, and you are not in a rush. There is cabbage. Always cabbage. Quietly, too little. Your millet also dies. You huddle near a fire pit so smoky that your eyes weep involuntarily. Tears that confuse the gods, who think you're mourning something. You're not. You're just cold. Pestilence. You swat. You wipe. You keep working. Bandits. Locusts. These are not surprises. These are seasonal events. Like lantern festivals, but crueler. A sickle that cuts as much conversation as it does wheat, waiting for someone to marry your daughter. A bucket patched with more rope than wood. These are your friends. You've named them. You whisper to them when no one's watching, because people come and go, but a good spade stays with you. You chew as if time itself depends on your restraint. It's not about fullness. It's about routine, boiled with a pinch of salt even if there's nothing to plant today. Or maybe you're weaving baskets, darning the same shirt for the 4th year in a row, collecting twigs for firewood and apologizing to the tree while you do it. More likely millet congee. If someone's been especially industrious, there might be a spoonful of fermented tofu or half an egg. A birthday sort of day. Or about how your brother once promised he'd build a better latrine, but instead moved to the city and never wrote back. Slow, sweet, in a strange, disappointing way. Still, you eat, slowly. Someone burps. That's considered polite. Then the work begins. Sometimes fields need tending. Dogs bark with the urgency of animals who have absolutely no authority. Weather, of course, governs everything. The Qing peasant is not a planner. He is a reactor. Too much rain. Your millet dies. In winter, you freeze, layered in cotton-stuffed jackets that smell like old soup and regret. In summer, you sweat. The kind of sweat that sinks into your clothes and never leaves. The kind of sweat that becomes a second skin. There are tools passed down through generations. A hoe with a splintered handle. And still, amid all this smoke, cabbage, noise, there is stillness. Peasants spend a great deal of time waiting for harvest, waiting for the rain, and so you sit at the edge of your field, or your door, or the communal well, and you stare into the middle distance, at nothing in particular, just ... stare. Sometimes with a straw in your mouth, you think about nothing or about everything in these moments, but there's beauty, not the kind you'd write poems about, the kind that arrives quietly, the sound of rice stalks in the wind, the way your mother hums without noticing, the taste of water when it's cold, truly cold, the way your youngest child laughs when he sees the moon, even if the world forgets you, even if no one writes your name down, Even if the emperor thinks your village is just a smudge on a census scroll, you were here. You breathed in smoke. You ate your cabbage. You kept going. Because that's what people did. And in the end, isn't that the only real legacy of empire? A quiet army of tired, coughing, half-starved souls, ... who just kept going. In the heart of every homif. You could call it a home, and not a well-behaved pile of mud was the courtyard. Not a grand courtyard with carved dragons or flowing fountains, just a square of packed earth, swept daily with a hand-tied broom made from reeds, because ancestors don't like mess. It wasn't pretty, but it was clean. Mostly when it wasn't raining, or windy, or the pigs hadn't broken free again. This courtyard wasn't just the center of the house, it was the center of everything. Where your grandmother sat, chewing sunflower seeds and remembering things no one asked her about. Where marriages were arranged, socks were mended, children were scolded, and chickens were executed with great ceremony and very little regret. It's also where gossip thrived. Gossip, you see, was the primary entertainment in a Qing village. There was no theater unless a troupe came through, and even then, the sound system was just someone yelling louder than everyone else. There were no books, no newspapers. A cousin was seen carrying a chicken in the middle of the night, with no obvious reason. Scandal, fascinating. Someone else's odd behavior was as good as foreign policy. There were stories, yes, but stories didn't change. A woman 3 doors down got a new comb. You blamed wandering souls. You tied a red string around the crib and whispered apologies for being so rude about your dead aunt during last week's dumpling folding. The imperial edicts were nailed to the village notice board, but heaven's signs were written in cracked eggshells and the shape of tea leaves. But not all talk was idle. On this altar stood. He sometimes helped in the fields, but mostly smoked a pipe and made noises of disapproval. Small bowls of rice, the occasional slice of roast pork if it was a festival or someone had successfully bribed a constable. She was the keeper of customs, grudges, and all known household recipes. She rarely complimented anyone. If she did, it was either sarcasm or a sign of impending doom. Superstition, though, never called that aloud, was the true law of the land. You hoped the ancestors would help you with next year's millet yield. They never did. But hope is persistent, like mildew. You moved around one another like ants in a hive, each person their approximate level of importance, and the everlasting residue of soy sauce in places you didn't know soy sauce could reach, more often in the summer, because sweat made you unbearable, even to yourself, less often in winter, when ice clung to your eyelashes and hygiene became a theory more than a practice. Cooking was a daily miracle, into something that could feed 7 people and not trigger an uprising, while pretending to admire your turnip. You hung red paper on the door to ward off spirits, but also in case a wandering tax official thought your house was too quiet and decided to knock. Knew how many beans were left, could fold laundry with one hand and scold a child with the other. Her face rarely smiled, her back always hurt, her eyes watched everything. You didn't hope for change, you just hoped the same things would keep working. And to the altar, You swept your house inward on New Year's Day. Outward sweeping would push your luck away. You never spoke the word death aloud unless you were prepared to host a ghost. If a chicken laid a double yolk egg, you made an offering to the kitchen godless to your husband. Break his ankle, depending on which omen book you consulted. If your baby cried all night, and there was, of course, the ancestor altar, a dusty wooden table, always slightly askew, nestled under the roof's eaves, where smoke drifted and flies congregated like bureaucrats. You didn't question the altar, you bowed. You offered. Family life was its own quiet form of chaos. The father, if present, was a figure of distant authority. The mother was the engine, slept last. Then there was the mother-in-law, whose presence was both architectural and emotional. Sons were precious, daughters were quiet, and if you had too many children and not enough food, well, the neighbors knew. Inside the home, it was strategy. You didn't speak unless necessary. Words took effort. The kitchen, such as it was, consisted of a clay stove, a few iron pots. Bathing was rare. Water was precious. Privacy was mythical. You bathed once a week maybe, and through it, all through the sweeping and the trying not to do things there, you knew what each day held. You knew what season it was, not by the calendar, but by the way the soil smelled and the way your knees creaked. And when they didn't eat, when the pigs fell sick, or the roof leaked, or someone in the village vanished in the night, you looked to heaven. You never said, "Life is hard." You just said, "Life is like this." And that was that. Evening arrived slowly in a Qing village. Not with color, just with the quiet agreement that work has temporarily ceased being possible. The sun bleeds into the hills. The dust settles like a final layer of the day's sigh, the kind that doesn't demand attention anymore. Your hands are stained with earth. Your feet are cracked like roof tiles in a dry season. And still, you do not sit down. Not yet. Ash from the cooking fire must be swept into the garden. Someone forgot to bring in the laundry again. The pot is placed back atop the coals, and water starts to bubble again, as if it too is just trying to get through the evening without being noticed. And the sounds shift from the clatter of hose and firewood to the muffled cough of your neighbor and the distant bark of a dog trying very hard to seem important. By now, your arms ache not the sharp pain of injury, but the dull, ancient pain of use. The water is reused to mop the floor. There is no waste. Waste is for people who have extra, and you never have extra. There is still so much nothing to do. The family sleeps side by side. If someone turns over, the whole room adjusts. The night is one long negotiation of body heat, breath, and the occasional muffled fart. Children must be rounded up. Cabbage again. But this time, with garlic scraped from the bottom of a jar, so old that no one quite remembers where it came from. There's tofu, but only because someone in the next village traded 3 duck eggs and a story for it. Dinner is an almost meal. A baby crying in the next house. The creak of bamboo in the wind. Thief? Just outside the door. Not far. Just far enough to imagine what it would feel like to have a pair of shoes that didn't leak, or a roof that didn't shudder when it rained. You pull the blanket higher. You remind yourself that the ancestors are watching. You don't find that comforting. Red banners painted with careful brush strokes and fewer mistakes than usual. Incense must be bought, if money allows. A neighbor gets into an argument about whose cow ate whose fence. The year changes, and nothing else does. Firecrackers tied together like the hopes of an entire neighborhood held with string. Some rice, if you're lucky, turnip greens. She rides to the groomess house on a red sedan chair, carried by 4 men who are deeply regretting their decision to volunteer. She lies awake that first night, wondering how long it will take to miss her old dirt floor. Firecrackers pop. Coins are thrown. The ceremony is formal, humorous, and involves a great deal of bowing to people the bride doesn't know. You chew slowly. Nor you. No one expects her to. If you're lucky, if you're not, you become another mouth. The dead are honored, named, remembered for about a week. Then the daily chores return. There's even a kind of quiet satisfaction when they do it properly after the harvest, to find enough dignity in sweeping the courtyard that it feels like ceremony. No wailing. To live long enough that the ancestors might actually remember your name. She just tries not to trip. You remember, briefly, that tomorrow is market day and that your last string of coins has been chewed by a mouse. You hang poems at your door, sweep the floor inward, and serve dumplings to everyone who walks by. Now, her hands tremble, her voice is sharp, her eyesight is fog. Children avoid her. She knows things no one wants to hear anymore, and still, she watches the sky as if it owes her something. You bow to elders. You watch children chase each other. Someone sets off a string of firecrackers that sets a chicken into full philosophical panic. The family sits close together, not out of affection. A single oil lamp flickers above the table, though it's really more of a slab. The flame sputters. A fly buzzes lazily around it. No one talks during the meal. Talking uses energy, and food is precious, even if it's not particularly good. After the meal, the bowls are rinsed with warmish water and hung upside down on nails hammered into the wall. Then comes the one thing everyone in the village understands. Sleep, or the attempt at it. The bedding is simple woven mats, maybe a thin blanket. The night is filled with noises, dogs howling, and if you can't sleep, you stare at the ceiling black. But then miraculously, cruelly, it's morning again. And the whole slow miracle repeats, unless it's a festival day. Festivals are, well, different. Not better, just less normal. They require preparation. Food must be saved weeks in advance. During Lunar New Year, you try to forget how tired you are. It's loud, it's warm, it's a relief, sort of. But even the joy feels performative, like trying to laugh with a cracked rib. By the evening, the decorations are already starting to sag. The rice wine has warmed into something awful. Then there are other, more personal holidays. A wedding, perhaps? The bride is young. Her face is covered. She doesn't smile. By nightfall, she's in a new house, with new rules, and a mother-in-law who is already preparing to be disappointed by everything she does. There are also funerals. The old are expected to die, paper offerings are burned, and for those who do live into old age in the village is not a reward. Your body betrays you. The old woman who sits by the well. A Qing villager does not expect immortality, but they do expect to endure, to keep going, to stretch rice into porridge, to turn leftovers into meals. And when they lie down for the final time in the same spot where they slept every night for 60 years, there is no drama, just a slow exhale, a flutter of moths near the altar, the rustle of reeds in the night wind, and somewhere a neighbor says they were quiet, they didn't cause trouble. That's something. Yes, that's something. In a world of toil, repetition might be the closest thing to peace. The man who got too rich to live now. Allow me to introduce Hessian. He sparkled. And then he stopped sparkling. But first, the beginning. He started his life as a guard in the imperial palace. Being close to the emperor was like sitting near a volcano that occasionally handed out gold coins. No, he had cheekbones. He had charm. He had a face that said, "I understand both poetry and blackmail," and more wealth than could be conveniently counted, especially by the people he was stealing it from. Dangerous, but lucrative. 1 minute, he's standing at attention in a silk tunic. The next, he's promoted far beyond what anyone in the bureaucracy thought reasonable. But reasonable is rarely fashionable. Hessian was handsome. This is often mentioned, which is surprising for historical records that usually describe men. The Qianlong emperor noticed him almost immediately. You know, all the things that can be quietly siphoned from without raising suspicion. If you read the kind of man who can smile while signing your own bribes. Within years, he had accumulated more power than most ministers, more titles than an overachieving scroll. He walked from one building to the next, his fingernails long enough to require protective cases made of jade bead, i.e. Dante plough fields, quite like having talons for fingers, but also deeply hilarious when you consider how quickly it all came undone. No, he ruled behind the scenes, sipping tea and pretending not to notice that his son was planning a full bureaucratic purge the minute he died. But he was a talented thief and was rumored to have demanded fees for every official posting like a Grimm. As Grand Counselor, he oversaw revenue collection, personnel appointments, infrastructure, grain storage. Some just say he was old and tired and liked the way Hessian poured his tea. He created positions for his relatives, inflated budgets, taxed regions to the brink of revolt, and then a long list of charges: embezzlement, bribery, extortion, abuse of power, treason, existing too confidently, the usual. Meanwhile, the Qianlong emperor kept promoting him. Why? We don't exactly know. Some say he saw in Hessian the son he never had. Others say he enjoyed the illusion of order. Whatever the reason, his mansion, massive, so large, it reportedly had over 30 courtyards. Not rooms, courtyards. His clothes, impeccable. His jewelry. He had so many personal attendants that one could be assigned solely to fan his soup. which is extravagant, because empires move slowly until they don't. They had suspected corruption, but they hadn't imagined Hessian's closet of infinite luxury. In 1796, which he did, the next, he was alone in a room with a length of silk rope, but two other bureaucrats who had the good sense to be corrupt, more politely, 3 years later, and within days, Daisy Hessian, in the whispered warnings of minor officials who didn't want to be next. His name still echoes as a kind of shorthand for maybe steal less. Next time there was no drawn-out trial, no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet sound of paper being stamped. His mansion was searched. What they found, let's just say it was less court minister and more final boss in a hoarding-themed video game he had, and a historical footnote that reads, possibly the most corrupt man in Chinese history, 10 banks worth of silver ingots, over 10,000 bolts of silk, 7,000 pieces of jade, millions of taels in cash and treasure. It took dozens of carts just to haul away his spoons. When news of this spread, and so, naturally, he was sentenced to death, but in the Qing Dynasty, or simply too inconvenient to execute publicly. So that's what Hessian did. One day, he was walking around in embroidered slippers, surrounded by servants holding lanterns and fanning his snacks. His body was wrapped, not to the people, of course. And that was the end, because you see, in textbooks, and the irony, despite his vast wealth, his titles, his reach, Hessian left no real legacy, no reforms, but in the Qing Dynasty, that still counts as success. When everything started to smolder, it began, as all large problems do, in places that maps didn't highlight and governments didn't particularly like to think about. Quiet hills, dirt villages, the margins, and then, as always, someone stood up and said, enough. Not loudly, just enough to be heard. This was the White Lotus Rebellion, which, but was in fact one of the earliest signs that the Qing dynasty had begun to rot somewhere deep inside its shiny ceremonial core. Seasons were, harvests were, rice prices, taxes, and taxes again. We begin in the late 18th century, around 1794, though to the people living it, dates weren't especially important. Land taxes were being sometimes invented, and when people couldn't pay, their homes were taken. The jobs didn't multiply, and while the emperor sat somewhere distant and divine, surrounded by eunuchs, incense, and calligraphy, the countryside quietly cracked. Not an army, just a religious movement, apocalyptic, equal parts Buddhism, folk belief, and lightly improvised theology. The details didn't matter. What mattered, because the taxes, you see, had grown teeth. Thousands of peasants, some of them armed only with farming tools and intense resentments. By this point in Qing rule, many peasants were being crushed beneath the boots of bureaucrats, like the recently departed Hessian, who, while gracefully pouring tea into jade cups, had accidentally bankrupted multiple provinces. Grain stores were looted and redistributed. In scenes that looked suspiciously, local gentry fled. Minor officials disappeared either. At the same time, population growth was exploding. Millions more mouths, not millions more bowls enter the White Lotus sect. Nor you, presumably a much better tax system. About as useful as an antique spoon in a sword fight. The actual fighting had to be outsourced to local militias and Han Chinese mercenaries, who were not known for their subtlety. No one counted peasants accurately, and corpses tend not to file reports of a new dynasty, just with fatigue of a world without the Manchus. The movement dissolved, its members folded back into society, or what was left of it, and life went on. They squeezed the countryside so hard that it stopped bleeding just to spite them, and they began, quietly, to recruit. The emperor wrote poems about victory. Paper lanterns were lit. The treasury, already dented by Hessians hoarding, and the Qianong emperor's love of calligraphy was nearly empty. Not with swords, with whispers, with small promises, with shared rice and stories told over dim lanterns. At first, then they ordered troops, and then they panicked because the rebellion spread across Sichuan. Farms were burned, forts fell, and all the while, the Qing army did what it always did. When faced with a peasant uprising, overreacted and generally misunderstood the entire situation. You see, the imperial forces were not what they used to be. The famous 8 banners, the backbone of the Manchu military, had now, they were ceremonial, decorated. Fighting dragged on for over 8 years. Towns became ashes. Rivers ran red, or at least muddy, with shame. And then, just as the rebellion had risen, it ended. The Qing cracked down brutally. The White Lotus leaders either died in battle or disappeared into legend. But it had changed. The empire had spent millions suppressing the rebellion. Entire provinces. The rebellion had shown quietly, firmly, that the myth of Qing invincibility was a costume held together with prayer beads and denial, and that beneath the throne. Of course, the court congratulated itself on putting down the rebellion, but far away, in the charred remains of villages where only chickens and ghosts now lived, there was no celebration, only ashes, and the slow rebuilding of homes that no longer felt like homes, and maybe about a world where a lotus blew and no one was hungry. How the Qing dynasty recorded catastrophe with great elegance and very little honesty. Beside incense burners, the size of bathtubs, sat a man with a brush, not a soldier, not a prince, a scribe. He was dressed in plain robes. His back was crooked from years of bowing and stooping. His fingers were permanently stained with ink, and his job, his sacred, miserable job, was to write things down, accurately, elegantly, in a way that would not offend anyone with the power to have him executed. You see, history in the Qing dynasty was not written to be true. It was written to be appropriate. And so, when the White Lotus, rebellion, and 8-year furnace of death, suffering, and societal collapse finally sputtered to a close, this poor man was given the task of explaining it all, in Confucian language, with no mention of how many civilians had been used as firewood. He dipped his brush and began. The auspicious harmony of the realm was briefly disrupted by heterodox elements lacking virtue. That's how it started. Not famine drove them to madness. Not people rebelled because they were taxed into oblivion. Not the army looted its own towns out of boredom and frustration. No, no. It was heterodox elements. A polite phrase, meaning peasants who were rude enough to starve in public, the scribe continued. The imperial forces, radiant in discipline and loyalty, carried out heaven's mandate to restore celestial balance, which, of course, a new form of bureaucratic cruelty, but none of that went into the scroll. Because the Qing Dynasty, like all empires nearing their expiration date, was obsessed with the idea that order must appear intact, even as everything crumbled behind the curtain. So rebellions weren't evidence of failure. They were cosmic disturbances, or because someone wore yellow without permission and thus threw off the balance of heaven. Nothing says we refuse to take responsibility, quite like blaming space rocks. And as for the emperors themselves, if something bad happened during their reign, they used metaphor, they used euphemism, they used entire paragraphs to say, "We didn't lose the battle, we just tactically unwon it," in accordance with ancient customs. To read these accounts today is to wander through a maze of denial wrapped in poetry. You will find phrases like, "The people's hearts grew cloudy. Heaven withheld its blessings. The emperor, radiant as the sun, issued decrees of compassionate rectification in the quiet spaces between bamboo strips, but not in the official histories. The truth was known, of course, but it was whispered, and if anyone dared to write too plainly, the penalty was not just criticism, it was often decapitation, preferably preceded by a trial. That included a list of your literary offenses and a very polite notice that your metaphors had endangered public stability. So, over time, the scribes learned to obey. They learned how to hide blood under calligraphy, how to make despair sound like seasonal rainfall, how to describe a dying empire as serene, though occasionally challenged by minor misfortunes, and perhaps they sat by candlelight and whispered to themselves, "This is not what happened." But they wrote it anyway, because the palace paid for elegance, not truth, and because sometimes the easiest way to survive an empire collapsing under its own weight is to pretend it's still standing. The quiet collapse of the Qing dynasty it ended, as these things do, with an emperor standing in a room that used to be important, wearing clothes that used to matter, surrounded by people who used to care. The year was 1912. The dust hadn't even settled on the 19th century, and the Qing dynasty, once the towering, silk-draped center of the Chinese world, finally came to a halt, not with assassins, but with a signature written under duress. The boy Emperor Pui was 6 years old. He sat on a throne he didn't understand, in a palace no one could afford to maintain, pretending to rule over a kingdom that no longer believed in thrones. Let's back up, because to understand the fall, for centuries, the Qing dynasty had ruled over a vast, diverse empire. They spoke Manchu, wrote Chinese, and believed in heaven's mandate, the comforting idea that all suffering was part of a divine spreadsheet they couldn't see. But by the late 19th century, tired, the bureaucracy tied to silver, tea, and denial. And then came the foreigner. The Qing objected. The British arrived first not with soldiers, but with opium, which they insisted was medicinal and very good for trade. Thus began the Opium Wars. Of course, they lost territory, lost face, lost Hong Kong in return, and more treaties that read like very passive-aggressive extortion notes. Then came the Taiping Rebellion, which we will not explore fully here, but even the court starts to notice the furniture isn't being dusted as often. Following that, the Boxer Rebellion, a beautiful example of what happens when angry, barefoot men with very strong opinions about martial arts decide they can defeat foreign guns through sheer patriotic enthusiasm. Spoiler, they couldn't. The Qing court tried to play both sides, porting the Boxers quietly, then loudly pretending they had an tea. Beijing was invaded. The Summer Palace was looted. She ruled from behind a screen, funded a marble boat. She delayed the inevitable like a grandmaster of stalling. A eunuch cried quietly into a lacquered tea tray. After that, it was just delay and decorum. Enter Cixi, the Empress Dowager, a woman of iron eyebrows and absolute control. But even she couldn't stop the century, because the people were changing. Educated youth began asking questions. Questions like, why are we ruled by people who don't speak Chinese? Why do we keep losing wars? Why does modernization always involve foreign gunboats, secret societies, students abroad? And then after years of tension and 1,000 small humiliations came Sun Yat-sen and the revolution of 1911. There was no great battle, just a mutiny. But he was 6. His hands were small. His crown was too heavy. He liked spinning tops. A series of declarations, and a slow collapse of Qing authority. Back in the Forbidden City, some wanted to fight. Most just wanted to keep their pensions. The general in charge, Yuan Shikai, a man with impressive facial hair and little patience, negotiated the abdication. On February 12, 1912, the imperial seal was handed over. No ceremony, no thunderclap. The Qing dynasty was over, in the palace, with servants, with rules. He woke each day. The empire was gone, but the costumes remained. The palace was cleared. The dragon throne was covered with a dust cloth and wheeled into a museum. He would later become a puppet emperor for the Japanese, then a prisoner, then a gardener. He died in 1967, wondering perhaps how so much silk had unraveled into soil. And the Qing, it became a memory, a mural, a dynasty remembered more for its endings than its glory. Not with fireworks, but with a soft, imperial whisper. It lasted longer than anyone expected, and perhaps that was the problem. The art of disappearing by 3 inches. It begins, as these things always do, when the child is too young to object. She is 5. She does not yet know the full length of her own body. Her mother never smiling, always efficient, hot water, and a pair of hands that have done this before. There is no ceremony. Her toes are folded under, pressed, curved, broken, the arches crushed downward. No priest. The little girl's feet are soaked, softened, like dumplings. Then they are dried. The bandages are wrapped tightly. Not once, not twice, but over and over again, like a message being hidden inside the body. This is foot binding, to create the elusive, the coveted, the absurdly impractical golden lotus foot. 3 inches long. The bindings are changed regularly. The child must walk, must smile when guests arrive, a condition not survivable without lifelong pain, day and night. And eventually, if all goes well, her foot will become permanently deformed into something almost elegant, almost horrifying, a crescent of bone and scar tissue. Her toes fused beneath the sole, her gait shifted permanently, her balance forever altered, coarse, barefoot, and undesirable. Not always, not openly. Ah! It was a whisper, a silhouette, a rustle of silk that hinted at refinement. Now comes the most uncomfortable part, because it wasn't done out of punishment. Grandmothers supervised. It was not men who bent over girls with hot cloth and practiced fingers. It was other women, those who had endured the same pain and now passed it on, not out of cruelty. It was done for beauty. Her dowry would shrink. Her brothers might not find good matches, because her improper body brought shame to the house. Her value was quite literally measured in inches, because in Qing society and for many centuries before eater-bound foot was not just decoration, it was a passport. To be unbound was to be. A bound foot, on the other hand, said, "I don't work in the fields." The bandages stayed on. The shoes' tiny hand-embroidered works of fiction stayed, tightly laced. A woman might spend her whole life pretending her feet didn't hurt, while hobbling from stove to bed, from market to temple. I come from a family that can afford to be decorative. I am disciplined, obedient, and possibly, if you are very lucky, marriage material. It was not just about attraction, it was about status. The feet were always covered, but everyone knew, and this is what makes it truly strange. Women enforced it. Mothers bound, because in many cases they were. A girl with unbound feet could not marry well. 3 inches, ideal. 4 inches, acceptable. 5 inches, may heaven help her. The irony, of course, was that most husbands never actually saw their wives' feet. Some became so skilled at walking in their bound feet that they were praised for their grace. As the dusty smell of incense in the family shrine, mothers winced. It was about control. Then life went on. They walked like willows. But because putting full weight on those mangled arches would have meant screaming, and scream they did, in private. Because in Qing society, at night. But her first, her primary, her essential virtue, quietly, elegantly, with shoes too small to hold her pain, was that she endured. The medical effects were predictably horrific. Bone fractures, infections, ingrown nails that turned septic, as normal as filial piety. Some resisted. A few families refused the custom. A few girls unwrapped their own feet in secret. But they were outliers. The price of rebellion was too high. Let that sink in. Pain, immobility, and disfigurement was socially rewarded. You see, it wasn't just about small feet to walk. She depended on others, on her husband, on her mother, on the exact people who wanted her obedient. This was her world. 10,000 careful steps, all within the same 10 square meters. She might be talented. When everything was haunted and most things needed burning. Imagine this. The moon is low and the wind is doing that thing again, moving. Just enough to remind you of people who no longer are. You round the corner of your home. You hear something. Not a loud thing, just a rustle, a cough. The sound of your own name being pronounced by someone who isn't you. Do you? A. Investigate calmly. B. Attribute it to natural causes. C. In Qing Dynasty China, the answer was always C, because ghosts were everywhere. They lived in rivers, in forests, in cupboards, and especially in bathrooms. Yes, bathrooms. Not because of its smell, although that certainly qualified as spiritual assault, waste, transition, and the unholy mingling of the living body and the underworld. The Chinese pit latrine, for all its earthy honesty, was considered one of the most haunted places in a household. So what did people do? They talked to the toilet, not metaphorically, not out of desperation, but to let the spirits inside know you were coming. Because, apparently, you knocked, you apologized, you said something respectful like, "Please, excuse me, I only wish to relieve myself and will be gone shortly." Then you squatted over a hole in the ground, surrounded by the soft, loving smell of fermented night soil and old fear. Children were taught this ritual from a young age. Elderly people insisted it was essential to prevent possession, hemorrhoids, or sudden and unexplained death. And if you forgot to knock, well, that's probably why your uncle fell into a coma during the Dragon Boat Festival. It didn't end there. Has the water recently tasted off? Wells were also haunted. Deep, reflective, and excellent at hiding vengeful spirits of drowned women. But to confuse evil spirits, who apparently suffer from very poor signage reading skills, because water is mysterious. Did someone fall into a well last year? Did a neighbor's cow refuse to drink for several days in a row? That's not algae. That's a grudge. So families would toss coins into the well, sometimes even burn paper dresses, because everyone knows the afterlife has a strict dress code. Doorways, too, were trouble. That's why you see red paper charms pasted above them, not just for color, not just for New Year. Charms featured tower spells, drawings of tigers, or even upside-down characters, because if you make something confusing enough, even the ghosts get bored and leave. Who could chant for 9 minutes straight while walking in slow, deliberate circles around your chicken coop? Every illness, every cough, every failure to sell enough turnips at market, of a broken ritual, of a forgotten offering. Not always a priest. Certainly not. Just a man, sometimes a woman who knew the old ways. He carried bells. Then he'd find the spiritual disturbance. Often a cracked beam, a spiderweb, or a smell no one could identify. Incense. A chicken feather that had been blessed under the light of a specific lunar phase. And sometimes a mirror, which was held up to reveal the true face of the spirit. That face never appeared, but the act itself was enough. The process. Elaborate. First, the exorcist would inspect the home, usually while muttering vague criticisms about your ancestor altar and commenting on the dust. Then came the burning. So much burning. Paper charms burned. Fake money burned. A crude sketch of a fox demon with too many teeth burned, preferably before the children saw it. Sometimes a pig's hoof would be placed outside the door. Sometimes roosters were used there crowing. In more serious cases, whispering into the rafters, eating your best pickled radish. In the morning, he would declare your home clean. The evil had been dispelled, and all it had cost was a week's worth of rice, your favorite blanket, and any remaining sense of rationality. But people believed because it worked. Or at least, and no one else fell into the well, and the cow started drinking again, and that was enough. Modern historians might scoff, might ask for evidence, but those historians didn't grow up sleeping 2 feet from a latrine. With a suspicious draft, they never had to whisper apologies into the darkness for accidentally insulting a tree. So yes, the ghosts were everywhere, and sometimes the only thing standing between your family and eternal spiritual ruin was a feather, a bowl of vinegar, and a very tired man with bells on his hat. The medicine cabinet of Qing Dynasty China. Let's say you wake up one morning, your head hurts, your tongue is pale, you consult your neighbor, you consult your grandfather, who says you didn't bow properly during the Lantern Festival 6 years ago. And this is clearly divine punishment. Eventually, or more precisely, a physician wearing long robes and the eternal expression of someone who has both too much confidence and a profound dislike for being questioned. He doesn't ask how you feel. No. He takes your wrist, because in Qing medicine, not just one, not just fast or slow, but up to 28 different pulse qualities. Wiry, slippery, soggy, choppy. Yes, soggy, like a dumpling left too long in soup. He closes his eyes, presses 3 fingers to your radial artery, then declares, with great certainty, that your liver is overacting on your spleen and your kidney essence is deficient. And this makes perfect sense to him, because the human body in this system isn't made of cells or microbes or hormones. It's made of yin and yang, 5 elements, and organs with surprisingly human personalities. The spleen is responsible for thoughts and digestion. The liver governs anger and ambition. The heart stores. The lungs control grief. And the kidneys? Oh, the kidneys are everything: your willpower, your fertility, your bones, your ears, and your ancestral essence. If something is wrong, something must be out of balance. Too hot, too cold, too damp, too dry, or, worst of all, stagnant. And so the treatment begins. No raw foods, no spicy food. If your liver, no cold foods. If your spleen is sad, only bland congee and thin tea, which taste like regret. The doctor writes a prescription in beautiful brush. It includes things like cinnabar all ground up, all mixed into little packets, to be brewed into a decoction that simmers for 3 hours and smells like moss, despair, and antique furniture. You drink it. The suction pulls the skin upward, leaving purple circles that last longer than the cure itself. Then comes cupping. Glass or bamboo cups are heated often, sometimes placed directly on acupuncture points, sometimes placed on slices of ginger that are placed on your belly button. Ah, the doctor says, admiring his work. Very toxic blood. Then, of course, a stick of mugwort. The goal, to restore warmth. Sometimes, it sets your blanket on fire. But the favorite, well, they're the spiritual traffic cops, poking your body back into cosmic compliance. Because nothing says balance like a dozen needles in your skull. Each acupuncture point corresponds to an invisible meridian highway for energy. Key blockages are like traffic jams, and the needles in the ear might fix your stomach. Needles in the hands can soothe your sadness. It's not that it didn't work. Sometimes it really did. But even when it didn't, the ritual itself felt curative. Others were told to bury a hairpin under a full moon. One particularly poetic cure for anxiety involved writing your name on a plum blossom petal and throwing it into a stream before dawn. And when medicine failed, you turned to talismans. Red papers with Taoist script were burned. Some patients were told to sleep with a beetle in their shoe. But none of these compared to the tonics. Made of ginseng deer antler, he can afford the good powder. Dried tiger penis pearls, rare, expensive, frequently ineffective. But to drink such a tonic was not just medicine, even if it didn't help your spleen. And of course, if nothing worked, the blame wasn't placed on the doctor. No, it was placed on the patient. For being born under an unlucky star, for neglecting ritual, for angering a kitchen god, or for simply not believing hard enough. And so, the people of Qing China continued their long relationship with suffering and strange tea. They lived, they ached, they endured, wrapped in cloth, pierced with needles, and steeped in concoctions, because illness wasn't just a malfunction of flesh. It was a moral echo, a cosmic imbalance, a lesson. And sometimes, the cure was simply to endure with grace, to wait, and to trust that your spleen knew what it was doing. Let's begin with the dreams. Not just any dreams. Not the abstract, blurry montages we know today. No. In Qing China, dreams were messages, carefully curated from the ancestors, from your own internal organs, or, depending on your behavior, from a displeased kitchen god who had seen what you did with the duck fat last week. Now, if you dreamt of falling teeth, that was bad, very bad. One tooth falling out. And quietly avoid making eye contact with elderly relatives for a few days. All your teeth crumbling into powder. Best to wake up, drink vinegar, bow to your household shrine, dreaming of water. That one's tricky, bad. Unless the tiger was walking towards you, in which case you were simply advised, terrifying. And if the water is rising up around your ankles in the dream and you re-wearing red, congratulations, your cousin may get sick soon. These dream interpretations weren't casual. They were written down, consulted, whispered over, one to honor the spirit. There were dream manuals passed through generations, some written by scholars, others scribbled in the margins of almanacs, already crowded with rice planting advice and diagrams of lucky turtle positions. That meant a spirit had entered your home. For a small fiat, a free meal if you were generous, and then tell you that the melon you saw in your dream last week was a metaphor for your upcoming marriage. Dreaming of roosters crowing at night, possibly too. Either way, eating pork or trimming your fingernails. Tigers, in dreams, represented power, unless the tiger was sitting. Some people made careers out of this. To prepare him for his journey, you would smear honey on his paper image's mouth, so that when he gave his report, it would be sweet and forgiving. Dream interpreters, self-declared and semi-terrified, traveled from village to village. Unless the melon was sliced, a visit was coming, of course. But dreams were only the night side of omens. The day was no less treacherous. Did your cat sneeze 4 times before breakfast? Did the door swing open by itself, and not the nice ones? The ones who forgot who they were, and might decide they lived in your cupboard now. Did a crow land on your roof and stare in the window for an uncomfortable amount of time? These were signs. Your aunt might interpret them, or your neighbor's second wife, who had a gift for knowing when the wind felt wrong. Household gods, too, had opinions. The kitchen garden-nosy spirit assigned to your stove reported annually to heaven. This is essentially spiritual bribery. But in a household where boiled turnips were considered a treat, and your ceiling leaked curses during the rainy season, you took every advantage you could get. Now, let's talk about wind. A sudden breeze from the east on a hot afternoon. Someone was speaking ill of you. The man who could predict floods based on how ants moved in April. The monk who had once sneezed precisely 12 times during the eclipse and correctly guessed someone's wife was pregnant from the west, possibly a spirit returning to check on its former chicken coop. Absolutely not. Why? Because to whistle after dark was to summon wandering souls. So children were taught. And then there were the lanterns. If a lantern flickered wildly without wind, if a lantern screamed, that is, made a high-pitched squeal as it burned, then someone had died nearby, or was about to. To fix this, burn mugwort under the eaves, listening for further messages. Every town had someone who kept track of these things. The auntie who remembered when 3 people in a row, and then the neighbor's dog gave birth to a piglet-shaped puppy. Superstition. But back then, it was a kind of emotional science, an attempt to understand a world that didn't explain itself, where plague came without warning, where emperors died mysteriously. In that kind of world, or fire, or that someone was about to visit, it meant you were not alone. Powdered faces in the Forbidden City. It began with ritual, a schedule so intricate, so rigid, so bureaucratically laced with etiquette, that to be late by 6 breaths could result in a demotion, a fine, not because he wanted to, but because heaven expected it. His sleep, his breath, his bowel movement stay were all monitored, as if the fate of the cosmos depended on them, another to hand him a very delicate piece of jade, with no known purpose beyond being ceremonially important. He would be dressed by attendants, another for his hair, always tea, served in cups so delicate that servants had to carry them with cloth-wrapped fingers, lest a single fingerprint desecrate the glaze and trigger a minor celestial imbalance. They were the administrative nervous system of the imperial machine. Some were powerful enough to command entire departments. Others were tasked with less glamorous duties, like adjusting curtain folds, or ensuring that the imperial turtles in the garden around him, the palace hummed. He did not walk far without being accompanied by at least 3 people and a scroll describing what his walk was meant to symbolize. Eunuchs darted from room to room silent. She decided who could see the emperor, whose hair ornaments were too loud. He did not dress himself, and still, he was often lonely, surrounded by walls, both literal and social. Now, to the empress, things were only marginally more human. She, too, awoke to ritual. Powder was applied to her facer white base, punctuated with delicate rouge. Her eyebrows were painted in precise, symbolic shapes, willows for gentleness, mountains for resilience. Her robes were layered, each thread a whisper of expectations. She presided over the inner court, groomed for elegance and obedience. Her days were spent not blinking too much, and making choices so subtle that outsiders would have missed the wars happening beneath each polite smile. She did not go shopping. The shops came to her, a long, slow parade of merchants, each displaying wares on silk cloths, jade, bracelets, sandalwood fans, rare teas harvested by monks who had not spoken aloud since the previous dynasty. She might take a fan. That was enough to feed a merchant's family for a year. And then there were the concubines. Ah, the gilded cage. Attendants stood nearby, pretending not to breathe too loudly. One recorded what he ate. Another recorded what he said. A third recorded what he didn't say. The imperial harem was not just a collection of beautiful women. It was a political ecosystem. Each woman was ranked, watched, whispered about. Some rose through favor. Some fell through scandal. Some never saw the emperor again after a single night, left to wander echoing corridors with nothing but poetry and envy to keep them company. Meals in the palace were performances, each flavor balanced not only for taste, but for symbolism. Duck for loyalty, lotus root, shark fin for status and questionable ethics. Trees were selected based on their ability to bloom at symbolic times. Even the fish in the pond had lineage and mood disorders. The emperor dined alone, and if something disagreed with him, an investigation would begin immediately. Someone would be... a chicken might be interrogated. Now, for entertainment, the palace had options. There were opera troupes, trained since childhood to sing like celestial birds and contort themselves into metaphors. There were scholars ready to debate the meaning of a single brushstroke until the stars came out. There were painters whose job was to make boredom look eternal and meaningful. And there were gardens. Ah, the gardens, manicured, composed, more poetic than practical. Rocks were arranged not for comfort, but for philosophical resonance. And yet, amid all this luxury, there was an emptiness, a sense that nothing truly belonged to you, not your time, not your choices, not even your name. If heaven disapproved, because being elite in Qing China meant carrying the burden of perfection, every gesture had meaning, every silence was policy, and every mistake and possibly punished 7 years later by a court historian having a bad day. So they smiled and bowed and sipped tea brewed from water blessed by a monk who hadn't blinked in a decade, and they wondered quietly what it might be like to eat plain rice, to wear cotton without scandal, to walk into the rain with no umbrella bearer, no metaphor, and no one watching. Temples, mandates, and the exhausting burden of cosmic approval. Let's begin with the emperor himself. He was not just a ruler. He was the son of heaven, not metaphorically, not symbolically. This was an actual title, with real responsibilities and little room for personal opinion. It meant that his reign, his laws, his headaches, all of it, were supposed to reflect cosmic harmony. If a comet streaked across the sky, if locusts ate too much barley, if a river flooded an inconvenient number of peasants, it was his fault, not because he'd caused it directly, but because the heavens were displeased. This meant that much of his life was spent apologizing to the sky. He held ceremonies, grand ones. He fasted, he lit incense, and sometimes he'd stand at an altar for hours, while priests chanted around him, and scribes documented his silence. The centerpiece of this celestial theater was the temple of heaven, a perfectly round, multi-tiered structure built for one purpose: to allow the emperor to communicate with the heavens in precisely prescribed ways. He visited once a year. He bowed, burned offerings, and requested blessings for a good harvest. No one else was allowed to pray there. The gods, it seemed, did not accept worship. But the emperor wasn't the only one burdened with spiritual bureaucracy. Officials, court scholars, royal family members, all were tangled in ritual. They consulted feng shui masters before building a room. They selected auspicious dates for weddings. Don't be surprised when your third cousin spontaneously develops boils. If you ignored it and scheduled your birthday banquet on the wrong day. The Manchu rulers of the Qing Dynasty, they were foreign conquerors, ruling over Han Chinese. So they maintained their own shamanistic traditions, spirit invocations, drumming rituals in freezing tents, while also adopting Taoist, Buddhist, and Confucian ceremonies to appease their subjects. This made for a lot of ceremonies. One day, they might be burning paper horses for the Jade Emperor. The next, they'd be hosting a Buddhist recitation with 10,000 lanterns, each representing a soul in need of karmic realignment. The palace even had its own priestly staff, not 1 or 2 monks, but entire departments of spiritual specialists. They managed prayer scrolls, conducted ritual bathings of sacred relics, catalogued incense types according to the emotional state they were supposed to influence. Feeling anxious about a border rebellion? Try floating plum blossom or eastern wind compassion blend. And yes, you'd bring them a concern maybe. Your youngest son was writing poetry that rhymed a little too well. Or perhaps The koi pond looked unusually reflective, and they'd cast yarrow sticks, interpret the and then say something utterly ambiguous like, "The dragon coils low, but the moon does not fear the east," which meant either A. C. Stop asking questions and donate more rice to the monastery. Dream interpretation, too, was elevated to an elite pursuit. The emperor's dreams were recorded: a rooster, an omen, a turtle talking to a cloud. Call the astrologers. And, speaking of astrology, oh, how the stars were consulted for governance. Major decisions, wars. That was a cosmic slap in the face. The emperor would be expected to confess his failings publicly, even if they weren't his fault. He'd fast, issue a statement about moral inadequacy, and perhaps sacrifice a cow just to cover his bases. You might ask, the elite believe all of this. Some did, many didn't. But that wasn't the point. In Qing society, belief was secondary to performance. You could doubt in private. You could laugh quietly in your robe. But you still showed up at the temple. You still bowed. You still lit the incense and murmured the words. Because everyone else was watching. Ritual was the currency of power. To perform it flawlessly, to skip it or fumble it, or heaven forbid yawn, during a reading of the spring rites. That was political suicide. So they performed. They sent prayers heavenward in envelopes of smoke and hoped the gods weren't too busy rearranging the clouds to notice. And thus, the elites of Qing China lived their lives under ornate roofs, but forever under the thumb of a sky that demanded paperwork, banquets, status, and the slow art of not dying at the table. Columns thicker than your self-doubt. Tables that seemed to stretch into next week, lined with bowls, platters, and curious decorative birds carved from winter melon. The guests arrive quietly, but never casually. Each step is rehearsed. Each robe is steamed into obedience. The sleeves alone are long enough to conceal, at least, to modest regrets and a complete family scandal. Now the banquet master gives the signal. A gentle patter of silk-slippered feet. Somewhere, a cymbal. Sighs. Music begins. Not playful. You're seated according to your rank, your recent behavior, and whether or not you've correctly memorized your compliments. To the emperor's favorite. He's seated closer to the throne, though never too close. That would imply ambition. The highest-ranking official, somewhere near the folding screen. You sit. You wait. You don't speak first. Then come the dishes. There are sea cucumbers rubbery. There are dumplings shaped like peonies. Fish served to resemble dragons. Duck tongues. Arranged like calligraphy strokes of edible confusion. 128. Each presented with ceremony. Each reflecting a subtle hierarchy of taste, season, symbolism, and how much the kitchen staff feared the head eunuch. There are birds, nests delicate, a whole pig's head grinning politely, lotus root sliced thin to symbolize continuity and endurance, boiled silk moths, because someone in the Qing Dynasty decided that was impressive. And now we're all pretending it's normal. You are not expected to eat everything. You are, however, expected to not eat the wrong thing, or jade, You must know which sauce goes with which item, which dish is served in honor of which celestial body, which bowl must be acknowledged but not consumed, lest you accidentally insult someone's grandmother. The chopsticks are ivory. There are usually 2 pairs, one for serving. Use the wrong one, and someone at the other end of the table might raise an eyebrow, a gesture that, in courtly language, is equivalent to being shot. And heaven help you if you drop one. A fallen chopstick is bad luck. 3 is how you end up being reassigned to a tea farm in Anhui province. As you eat, conversation flows like honey over gravel. It is slow, careful, and never truly about the topic at hand. You might be discussing peonies, but you're actually complimenting someone's economic policy. You might be complimenting the fish, but you're hinting at dissatisfaction with the Minister of Rights. You might say nothing at all, and still be heard saying too much. Every syllable is weighed. Every smile is political. He nods in disappointment. The evening continues. Even your silence must be the right kind of silence, respectful, but not too contemplative, lest people think you're planning something. As you reach for your 3rd dish, a eunuch glides by, and just like that, you realize you've used the vinegar dish intended for the Empress's cousin. Ceremonial oyster. You nod in apology. There is no clinking of bowls, no loud laughter unless initiated by someone of high rank, at which point everyone must laugh for exactly the same duration, as if possessed by the same ghost of politeness. Wine is served, Shaoxing wine, or not at all. Drunkenness is only acceptable if performed with dignity, and only if everyone else is planning to do the same. Now the entertainment begins. Not music, no. That's been droning in the background since soup course number 17. This is the opera, or the host, if the emperor couldn't be bothered. A full performance. Actors in ornate robes pirouette through the room, telling a story everyone already knows, but must pretend to find newly profound. You do not applaud. You nod thoughtfully. If tears appear, you let them hang delicately in your eyes. Like an unpaid debt, never wipe them. Desert arrives. It is likely candied lotus seeds. At last, after 4 hours of tension disguised as leisure, the emperor rises. Everyone stands at once in unison. Like leaves blown by a particularly well-mannered breeze, you bow. You file out. It's a gesture of hubris. You exhale. You did not speak out of turn. You did not laugh too early. You did not insult anyone's koi fish with your posture. And tomorrow, your name has moved 1 line lower. Why? No one will say. But perhaps next time, don't pick up the duck tongue before the official from Suzhou does. Chessboards, garden stones, and the dangerous art of being too cultured. Imagine a man in his late 50s. Silk robes, the color of pond water, an expression like a sigh carved into human flesh. He sits beneath a plum tree, staring at the rocks in his courtyard, with the reverence most people reserve for grandparents or sacred scrolls. This is a retired Qing official, or more accurately, politics has quietly pushed him out, and now he spends his days pretending it was his choice. His garden is manicured to look natural, a paradox that perfectly reflects elite philosophy. The rocks are not randomly placed, they're imported. selected, each one chosen for its resemblance to a mountain, a moral concept, or a particularly noble kind of loneliness. The willow tree droops at a carefully calculated angle. The lotus pond has exactly 7 visible blossoms. The bridge curves, not for convenience, but for metaphor. He does not walk across it. He stands near it, gazing, occasionally quoting a line of Tamp's poetry to no one in particular. Shui Ting shoot. When the water is clear, the stones appear, deep and utterly useless for taxes, but very helpful for sighing meaningfully during long afternoons. Now we find him with his brush, calligraphy, not merely handwriting, a conversation between ink and paper, a dance where every stroke reveals not just skill. He dips the brush into ink ground by hand on a stone slab. The act of preparing the ink takes 30 minutes, during which time he remembers all the things he meant to forget: his failures, his demotions, the one time he misquoted Confucius, and everyone politely ignored him for 3 months. Finally, he begins. The brush strokes flow, or they don't. Too much pressure, aggression, too little. Weak will, unbalanced spacing. In the world of elite Qing society, your calligraphy could get you promoted or investigated. So, he practices. Slowly, repeatedly. Each character, a test. He is writing to reveal what kind of man he is. Now it's time for a game, not go. That's for philosophers, not dice. Xiongqi Chinese chess, a board of symbolic war, which is, coincidentally, also how elite marriages work. 2 men sit beneath a pergola. Ah, your horse leaps. Like a poem written in haste, and your cannon moves as though drunk on unripe grapes. They do not smile, they do not gloat. Victory is a small twitch of the eyebrow. Defeat, a single finger tapped against porcelain. Spectators watch in silence. A bird calls in the distance. Now, perhaps a bit of poetry. But here's the problem with poetry in a leeching life. It's dangerous. You see, anyone could write a poem, but writing a poem too well meant you were trying too hard. Not writing one meant you were uncultured. Quoting one from memory was acceptable unless you picked a line that contradicted the prevailing mood of the gathering. In which case, and so the retired official crafts his lines carefully. A single reed bends in the autumn wind, not broken, but longing for spring. Beautiful, subtle, safe, except. Now everyone's wondering if he's criticizing court policy, or mourning a lost promotion, or comparing someone to a bent reed. Better to write a bad poem on purpose, or just praise someone else's poem in a tone that implies you've written better, but don't need to mention it. Then there's painting, usually of mountains no one has climbed, or waterfalls no one has seen, sometimes with a single figure. Elite paintings were landscapes of the soul, which is a poetic way of saying they were really good at drawing trees but not interested in depicting human noses. Red stamps. Not one, not two, but sometimes dozens. Art was signed with seals. The more seals, the more commentary, until the painting looked like it had caught a rash of approvals. And still, through all this cultivated leisure, a certain restlessness. Because to be elite in Qing China, your garden was a metaphor, your brushstroke and your silence was just as loud as your speech. So even in his retirement, he sips his tea. And whether that was, in fact, the beginning of his slow, polite exile into this very garden. He composes couplets about clouds, and he wonders silently if anyone remembers the time he corrected the Grand Secretariat's tonal mistake in a spring festival poem. The sound of falling teacups, what remains of the Qing, and what never left. So, it's 2025, or so, the calendar says. You live in a world of buttons, apps, glowing rectangles, and soup that arrives in under 30 minutes. But even here, in this world of seamless updates and rapid disappointment, the Qing Dynasty hums beneath the surface. You hear it when a bureaucrat asks for the correct format. You feel it in the weight of family expectations that stretch back further than memory. You see it when someone bows slightly, not because systems, once built, are hard to unbuild. An etiquette, once whispered into 1,000 generations, becomes part of the bloodstream. Let's begin with the obvious. The Qing Dynasty was obsessed with it. Rank, title, position so specific, so sacred. Whether you were a rice inspector in Fujian or a concubine with 3 syllables in your name, your place was known. Today, well, you might not wear a jade badge to indicate your office rank, but you probably still measure worth by titles: director, senior, executive, verified, but in email, signatures, and LinkedIn headers. And while the Forbidden City no longer holds court, the digital world has its own palace's carefully constructed profiles, curated feeds, decorative humility, modern status symbols. Not ivory chopsticks, but smart watches. Not dragon robes, but minimalism. Next. Rituals. In Qing China, everything had a time, a method, and a meaning. You didn't just drink, you brewed it, and complimented the pot before you spoke to the host. Now, well, you might not chant before entering the bathroom, but there's still ritual everywhere. We call it process. Morning routines, coffee habits, corporate jargon so carefully rehearsed, it might as well be incanted from bamboo. Scrolls. Loop me in. Per my last message, I hope this finds you well. They are modern calligraphy. And then, in Qing China, life was a theater. Your face was your stage. Bowed when expected. You performed harmony, even if your soul was out of tune. That hasn't gone anywhere. You still perform. With friends. With strangers who stand too close. In elevators. In meetings. On calls. On holidays. Not in scrolls. Not with fans and pavilions, but with lighting filters and modest statements of carefully polished success. We've simply moved the stage, and the pressure to appear composed, only now it's dressed in business, casual and self-deprecating humor. Even our dreams, once read by scholars and fortune-tellers, are now interpreted by algorithms, apps, therapists, or memes. Dreamed about losing teeth last night. Oh, that's anxiety. Or Mercury in retrograde. Or just the shadow of some imperial kitchen god who refuses to stop watching you from across centuries. And what of the emperor? Well, he doesn't sit on a throne now. He is a collective. respond faster. An invisible pressure that says, produce more, but not too much better, lest you disturb the balance of things. The mandate of heaven now comes with quarterly reviews and performance indicators. And you're not a peasant, you're not even a courtier. But you might still wake up tired. Still bow your head slightly when someone important enters the room. Still say nothing when someone says something wrong. And at the end of the day, you may still lie down. What it means to be remembered. What it means to live in a system older than you, larger than you, more polite than you, but never truly kind. So no, you don't live in the Qing Dynasty, but sometimes you carry it in gestures. And as you drift now into sleep, as your ceiling waits quietly for you to stop scrolling, know that somewhere, in some forgotten poem written by a man who never truly spoke his mind, is a line about rest and shadows, and how all empires eventually become dust. But etiquette is eternal.